This is a very conditions-based, realistic plan to bring stabilization to Gaza and to liberate it, which is really key, from terror rather than occupy it. This is probably one of the most politically complex operation endeavors that has been attempted in a generation. You only will deploy the stabilization forces to within Gaza when there is an area that is already stable, and they will be stabilizing it. Active combat against Hamas, I think that will be left to the IDF, who is the most prepared and capable to do it, while these areas that are stable be transitioned over to stabilization force. There's so much to be done from especially even the de-radicalization. That's a huge undertaking where you would want, like Saudi Arabia, UAE, others who have been able to de-radicalize extremist ideology, Islamic ideology from most of their societal components.
Okay, folks, welcome to this episode of the MirYam Institute Situational Briefing with me, Benjamin Anthony. And before we get to the show, I just want to encourage all of you, if you're enjoying our content, please take a moment, if you're watching on the YouTube channel, to subscribe to the show and to hit the bell so that you get all of the alerts when we publish a new program, and you are the recipients of all of our cutting-edge footage and our discussion and conversation on all things Israel. And if you're listening on the audio podcast, whether it be Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever it is you download your podcasts from, please be sure to hit the subscribe button and to leave a rating and review. Doing those two things really does help us to reach an ever wider audience. And I thank you very much in advance of your partnership in that regard. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by an individual who really doesn't need any introduction. His name is John Spencer, and it's our privilege to be able to announce that he is now a MirYam Institute contributor. He is considered one of the world's leading urban warfare experts and has conducted extensive on-the-ground research in Israel and the Gaza Strip since October the 7th, and I've had the pleasure of seeing him undertake that research both on his way into Gaza and on his way back out of Gaza. We never actually, our paths never actually crossed inside the Gaza Strip, John, but it's great to have you with us. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm a student of all wars, so I'm really excited to be a part of this very professional team, and I'm happy to be with you.
Thank you, John. And so you've written your first paper, your first piece of analysis for the MirYam Institute is up on our website. I'll link it in the show notes, and it's called, with regard to the International Stabilization Force that's being propped up now, it's called In Gaza, Think Kosovo, Not Lebanon. And what you've done there is you've essentially juxtaposed the success of the international force that was deployed towards Kosovo versus the failure of the UN interim force in Lebanon, known as UNIFIL by its acronym, there inside southern Lebanon. And it's all against the context of what is working its way through the UN Security Council right now, namely the American draft for what this force would look like. It's facing opposition from the Russians, from the Chinese, both of whom have veto power there. But tell me why you decided to write this paper.
Sure. So I decided to write it, one, coming out of the 20-point plan, and actually my recent visit to Gaza about 4 weeks ago, hours before the peace plan was signed. And then looking through the variables, we get word that the UN security mandate, which if you look at all of these things that we're going to talk about, from the Southern Lebanon UNIFIL mission, Kosovo, Bosnia, East Timor, all had UN security mandates, which is really important. And I'm sure we'll talk about that just from a legitimacy for all the different contributing countries. It's the best case scenario to have one. The article is about having the right principles in this, learning from bad examples and good examples. But the reason I wrote it first and foremost is that we got word that this was making its way through the UN Security Council, and even some newspapers getting draft versions, although the draft version is never what the final version becomes. But there's really I think positive things that were in the draft version, like take all means necessary to execute the mandate, things that again weren't in the UNIFIL mandate, what was implemented and then really never really foresaw. That's really what drove me to write it.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful piece, and I think that there are a lot of Israelis. So I'm representing somebody who lives in Israel, who fought in this war inside the Gaza Strip, who is, as all Israelis are, the first to have to live with the outcome of any international policy with regard to disarming Hamas and demilitarizing the Gaza Strip writ large. And so it's that view that I want to represent. And I'll begin by saying that most Israelis, when we hear about anything making its way through the United Nations for ratification of a United Nations body, we immediately view it askance. It's just the nature of the beast for very, very good reasons. And one of the reasons that this is making its way through is that the contributing nations insist that it has a UN mandate. But there's also clear precedent for it, as you've just alluded to. Do you expect it to pass through the UN? What do you think will come out the other side?
I do. It's a great question. I agree. If I hear the words UN, it doesn't bring a positive feeling in a history, and there is a difference between a UN General Assembly vote and a UN Security Council vote. With the permanent members, and you mentioned China and Russia, and then, of course there's UK and France. I don't think any of them have a serious reason to oppose the mandate. If their populations, especially, were discussing stopping the operations. This is a very conditions-based, realistic plan to bring stabilization to Gaza and to liberate it, which is really key, from terror rather than occupy it. I believe it will eventually pass. The article is more about whether we really want to see in the principles and what are the mission, the task, the authorities, and really the kind of fallback, which is why what I've heard, the draft will have only a 2 year mandate, which will be, I think is positive, because you don't want this forever mandate that doesn't have a conditions on, okay, it's not working. And I'm sure we'll talk about both of our experiences, yours way more than mine, as somebody who's just visited and studied more than one war, to include southern Lebanon, where you can stand in northern Israel, look down at the UNIFIL headquarters, nice beach property, and just scan your eyes to the right, and you see a Hezbollah flag on a Shia village home, and the what's not in that mandate.
Yeah, and just to draw on my own experience there up north, I was a young soldier in 2006 during the events that were really the precursor to the Second Lebanon War. And as we moved along the border between northern Israel and southern Lebanon, I could see very, very clearly in the very near distance UNIFIL operatives, UNIFIL personnel, whatever one would want to call them, regularly fraternizing with Hezbollah, running the flag up and down the flagpoles, sitting down, having a cup of coffee with them, and then moving on. And of course, when war did break out, and it was a war that I was deployed into inside Lebanon, UNIFIL were the first to flee the area. And so I want to start with that as the example of failure that you put forward, John, because you wrote that with regard to UNIFIL, over decades, Hezbollah entrenched itself across southern Lebanon and built formidable capabilities, even within sight of UN positions. And I've even gone beyond all of that. So, one of the very, very important distinctions here is that this would be an enforcement force rather than a peacekeeping force. Tell us why you draw optimism from that.
Um, because I understand really the true task and the context that it'll be necessary to, even if Hamas was to be completely disarmed right now, the true task of stabilizing different areas within Gaza will require very specific enforcement capabilities, just like in Kosovo, which, if you look at the task, and sourcing is really important when we write. And in this article, we source. You can just go to the UNIFIL mandate, and you go to the Kosovo mandate mission page and look at all the individual tasks, like actual keeping the order, securing areas. And there is differences in studying different forces between peace monitoring, peacekeeping, and this is why I like that this is called a stabilization force, because it really gets you in the right mental framework of what it will be doing, what's its missions, and what are the tasks that it should be doing in order to create stability. Of course, security is always the big one. And we'll talk, I'm sure we're going to talk about like what does that look like practically on the ground? How are they securing areas to keep them stable? Which is really key. But that's why I think that everything I've seen discussed about the stabilization force is that it's not this glorified blue helmet peacekeeping force. Peace monitoring force really is the right terminology on what was supposed to be happening. No Hezbollah army below the Litani River with no actual like clauses on, okay, it's obvious to everybody here what to do about it, which really is also in these success stories like Kosovo, Bosnia. There is a NATO kind of country involvement in a NATO command center, a part of that, which is, again, this is different than UNIFIL. The stabilization force will have this, the GCC, the coordination cell, the peace board with the United States and a few other actors on it. These are all like beyond the mandate, but also critical to it is the bureaucracy, the structure, and the right conditions based language in the mandate.
And that board of peace that you just referenced there is it seems to be the first bone of contention that the Russians and the Chinese are objecting to. They don't want that board of peace to be chaired by President Trump, it seems. But you wrote in the article, and again, I'm going to link the article in the show notes. It's also up on our website. And I encourage people to go there because they can discover not only what you wrote in its fullest, but also where you sourced your points from. You said that this force, this stabilization force, will be responsible for, quote, the destruction and prevention of rebuilding of military terror and offensive infrastructure, as well as the permanent decommissioning of weapons from non-state armed groups. How do you see them doing that?
Sure. Great question. And I've gotten this as while the scale is large, as in the entrenchment of Hamas, the militarization of every inch of ground in Gaza over 20 years, billions of dollars. There's also lots of historical examples of how this is done. How do you take an enemy controlled territory? Of course, there's a kind of a rheostat in Gaza of, okay, what's more Hamas controlled at this moment and not. But how do you take a piece of enemy ground? And it is the clear hold and build that has been discussed in plenty around the world and for a long time, but not it both has a strategic implication and a tactical implication. I think tactically, this is also talked about in the 20-point plan, is that once an area is cleared of Hamas resistance, active combat, then these areas, and they could already be a completely quite safe zone, which is another term that's been talked about, then that area can be handed over to a stabilization force to hold it, right? Clear, hold, build. And then once it's further made clear of like infrastructure, because you have really the physical terrain will be something that no country that will be involved other than Israel has ever faced, as in the 600 miles of tunnels, the IEDs, so many elements of just clearing the ground, preparing it to be stabilized. And then, of course, you build. And then the building, which will be a part of the mandate too, is what functions do the stabilization forces have across all lines of efforts? We call them like security. Okay, what security forces are you building? Then you have all the essential services. Then you have the education and de-radicalization, which will be vital. These are the things that you can do, but it's not full out all across the Gaza Strip, not even all across the yellow area, right, of the 53% that Israel controls. You do it in an Inkblot strategy, bit by bit, and some areas will go quicker. Some areas will take a long time and will be there may be hiccups or like we're seeing. People will contest the stabilization of areas and test the structure there. And really, again, back to the 20-point plan, what I saw in that was a lot of language, a lot of people involved that seem to have learned lessons from the past. I'm hoping to see the same from the mandate for the stabilization force going forward.
Also important to keep in mind that for those who recall President Trump's speech in Saudi Arabia, he really railed against the idea of the United States engaging in nation building. And this does not allude to the idea of nation building at all. But I think that when people object to it, and incidentally, just to put my cards on the table, I'm not confident in the prospects of this stabilization force at all. I'll talk about that in due course. But you haven't said you are confident, you're not confident. What you've really written out here is this is what is needed if it's going to work. You're not saying it is going to work. You're saying this is what is needed if it is going to work. And one of those is an avoidance of a mission statement, namely, we're going to go forward and build a nation there. Why do you think that renders it so? Why is that so important? Why does it render it perhaps with a better chance of succeeding?
Absolutely. I think it's a great point. And I tried never to do predictions, just understanding the uncertainty of war. And now you have, and all war is political. I mean, this is probably one of the most politically complex operation endeavors that has been attempted in a generation of all these different names, countries you're talking about. Like you said, at that geopolitical great power competition perspective, although Gaza is not that, where if you were talking Syria or somewhere like that, I wouldn't be as hopeful or confident about a mandate or being able to stabilize or de-radicalize, terror-free, none of that. But this is actually a very small piece of ground with control of a lot of external variables that you can't do in other areas. Why not nation building? One, I think that's kind of like a dirty word that's been used because of how many failures there was on trying to create democratic nation states with like full civil liberties and everything in places where it never existed, let alone with cultural aspects on why whatever is trying to be built wouldn't work. That's not what's been talked about at all with Gaza. I don't see that happening at all, even from the security line of effort, right? A nation building force would build an army that would then protect the nation, just like we did in Iraq. We built an army not to fight terrorists like ISIS in their own country, built them to fight an invading other national level force and really didn't set them up for success. But that's a separate conversation. This is about creating stabilization forces, so policing in once these stable bubbles of secure areas, safe zones, communities is set up. But it
So
applies to every element. Governance. You're not building a national governance. I mean, everything. It's not nation building. Even at the tactical level, I hope that's made clear to everyone.
yeah, I think it needs to be emphasized because I think people fear that as a pursuit as much as they're fearful of mission creep whenever boots on the ground are deployed. So one of the other aspects that you talked about when highlighting the obvious points of failure in UNIFIL's mission statement is that you said that it was a peacekeeping mission without peace to keep, which I think is a wonderful turn of phrase, very, very accurate wrap up of one of the inherent problems there. Wouldn't this International Stabilization Force in the Gaza Strip really be a stabilizing force without any stability to implement with Gaza in its current form?
No, I don't think so. And this is the nuances that professionals understand, and I think you do, and other parts of the team where others wouldn't. I think this you only will deploy the stabilization forces to within Gaza when there is an area that is already stable, and they will be stabilizing it. So this gets to, okay, who will be doing the disarming and things like that. I strongly believe, based on what I know from on the ground research, but also within the development of this plan, that active combat is what a this force would be doing. Active combat against Hamas. I think that will be left to the IDF, who is the most prepared and capable to do it, while these areas that are stable be transitioned over to a stabilization force. And then you work through the principles that I talk about in the article about having local legitimacy, basically clearing an area, only letting certain individuals into that area. And this is more of a policing action, because this is of course, the political risk for any country, whether it's Indonesia, whoever actually is a part of the forces that will be stabilizing and securing. There's close connection between the two, although stabilizing is much bigger, as in stabilization operations and essential services and all these things. But the worst case scenario is that you have these forces die at the hands of whatever terrorist organization in Gaza, and then you would see a hiccup in the actual moving forward of implementing this area by area. I do believe, to your question, there will only be stable areas that the IDF have cleared of military factions, Hamas, that will be transitioned to the stabilization force. At least that's what I think and see for going forward, and doing it piece by piece, which actually is historical for any even clear build hold. If you look at differences between Second Battle of Fallujah versus Ramadi when the instructions to the commander is don't pull a Fallujah, and they do it area by area rather than trying to take on the whole city, the enemy held city. There is plenty of historical examples that you could do this bite by bite.
And there's also some positive developments as well, despite my own skepticism, where we've seen that Indonesia has announced that it's ready to commit 20,000 troops to this stabilization force. And that's very interesting. We all remember his groundbreaking speech at the United Nations. And so people should be aware that there is definitely some real momentum. And in line with that momentum, you've highlighted the Kosovo case. Just briefly, what was it about the Kosovo example that you drew from as reason to be hopeful for the success of the ISF?
Well, one is that lots of people make predictions, lots of people do analysis, lots of people have ideas of what's going to succeed or fail. So, I'm a pretty common sense kind of guy. So I look at what has been by all variables, kind of like when victory in war, like let's measure it against the objectives. So based on the objectives, the missions, and the task of Kosovo, you can say time has shown true that it was a success and it's still a non-war zone, stabilized, where human rights are enforced and there's still partnership, which I think we'll talk about as well. Um, Specifically, though, it's just literally taking all these different historical peacekeeping or stability or just peacekeeping, but also stability operations and putting them up side by side. Not opinion, not objective, just fact based. This is what was this mission say and their task list in Kosovo. It's actually a rather long list that takes, I mean, literally securing good order, demining, demilitarization, disarming, all the words that are actually required when you start talking like legal terms to give forces the rules of engagement and legal authority to do things inside of the mission that they're assigned to.
And this point that you keep emphasizing about the importance of the mission statement as being central to the viability of the mission and to the success of the mission, I think is very, very well taken. I would highlight something that concerns me here. You wrote about the fact that 50,000 troops were deployed to that theater, and those troops came from the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, so on. And I would argue that there's broad alignment when it comes to the philosophies of those states. Probably somewhat agnostic to the specific area that they were deployed to, probably pretty much lined up well behind the idea that they don't like seeing actual, real, true genocidal ambitions playing out, but broadly aligned, broadly aligned. And here you have the introduction of actors such as Turkey, Qatar, Egypt, the UAE. Just to take a couple of those, Israel doesn't want Turkey anywhere near the place. It doesn't want Turkey inside the Gaza Strip at all under any circumstances. You obviously have this dissonance between the way that Turkey views Hamas. Turkey seems to be a huge fan and almost a patron of Hamas in some ways today. Egypt views Hamas as its mortal enemy. Its antipathy towards the Muslim Brotherhood is well known. I don't see how those forces are going to coalesce around this particular mission statement. Israel does not want Turkey there, but also Israel has faced the horror of the October 7th attack that in no small part came about charitably because of Egyptian negligence along the border between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. More realistically, in my point, with the go-ahead, the turning of a blind eye by the Egyptians to what was going on that border, and we bore the brunt of it in the most horrific way. So the idea that we would outsource any degree of security to the Egyptians is anathema to me. And Egypt is also proving itself very inept, as you and I have discussed, at patrolling the ongoing smuggling of contraband into Israel via the fence by way of drones, something that's so severe that actually it's now a closed military zone. That entire road along, or very significant parts of the road along the Israel-Egypt border is now closed. So those are just a few of the problems. We could talk about Qatar. I don't think time permits, but it's obviously very complex. UAE wants to be there, but it only wants to be there if there's a pathway towards a Palestinian state, at least by mention, if not by implementation. Israel doesn't want anything to do with that. So it's not just the mission statement, it's also the composition of the components within the mission statement. And this is very different to Kosovo.
Absolutely. And there are limits to comparison or comparative analysis that we do. Context, context, context. On this, and of the 40 nations, and I've heard even Israel political leader statements that Turkey won't put boots into Gaza, period. Um, it's almost I don't know if there's a correct analogy of team of rivals, but it's a historic moment personally to have these countries volunteer and want to be a part of something that says we all agree that this is the end of Hamas, this is the end of terror in Gaza, and that all of us are signing this paper saying that that's the path forward. No, it is conditions based. I think that's historic for the region in general. And I understand the true breadth of the task that is being undertaken and how much a country can, because it's all about politics, of course, it wants its name a part of it, and why even Egypt, of course, no fan of the Muslim Brotherhood, of Hamas, of terror on its borders, what it did in 2017 to displace 50,000 Gazans on their side in a counterterrorism operation and filled the tunnels with sewage. There's so many nuances to each individual country. While when you start talking about the sheer political tint that was created in the countries that were brought into it with leadership of Israel involved, United States leadership, and countries that you want, like Indonesia and others, a part of that conversation. There's so much to be done from, especially even the de-radicalization, which wasn't done in some of these other examples. That's a huge undertaking where you would want, yeah, like Saudi Arabia, UAE, others who have been able to successfully de-radicalize extremist ideology, Islamic ideology from most of their societal components, let's say. So I'm not flippant. I know these are all huge concerns, but I'm actually hopeful, understanding of what actually having that country in the tent does while having these boards. And again, the composition of stabilization forces, right? People will say the name and then they'll jump to, well, that's who will deploy troops. And no, 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 that's nowhere part of the conversation. And I think people are making a giant leap of inference if they're involved in some way, even if it's just providing humanitarian aid, helping connect water pipes, you name it. There's so much to be done.
So the credo of the organization is Israel's future in Israel's hands. And just as we move towards the end of this discussion, I wanted to take my role as an Israeli, someone who's served, as I said, like so many others who have served inside this war, and really present some Israeli objections. And then I want you to, or objections that may be voiced by Israelis. I happen to stand behind these objections. And then I want you in your position as contributor. And the reason we're so pleased to have you as a contributor, John, is that, of course, you are a non-Israeli with unique expertise, able to enrich the conversation, add context to the conversation, and provide a different perspective for everybody to consider. So here are some of my objections. You can pick any of them that you like. Some of them we've dealt with, others we haven't. And maybe we could just deal with two or three. The first one is that this is going to require the gradual further withdrawal of IDF troops closer to the former border that was there between Gaza and the state of Israel. And that almost by definition is going to mean that Hamas comes closer to our villages, to our towns, to our kibbutzim, to our cities, something that Israelis will not be comfortable with, especially given the idea that there could be a bunch of Qataris running around who are responsible for some element of this stabilization force, including, well, considering the caveats that you've mentioned. The other one is that there will be a determination within Israel to ensure, at the very least, that the IDF continues to enjoy full operational freedom when it comes to countering terror threats that it identifies and feels need to be eliminated. Now, that does not stack up well, that demand, against what was reported, namely that Israel is actually taking a back seat to the United States when it comes to overseeing what's going on inside Gaza. I don't know how true those reports were. I'd love to hear your view on it. Another objection that I raise is that I wouldn't want to see this, were it to be successful, and again, I'm not optimistic about its prospects for success, but were it to be successful, I wouldn't want it to be overlaid thereafter onto Judea and Samaria. I could see that happening, wherein people say, look, things are stable, things are quiet, relatively quiet. Let's now go and do the very same over in Judea and Samaria. I wouldn't like to see that present. Two very different theaters, but we'll see what happens there. And the final issue that I have is that Israel has always said and operated by the idea that we defend ourselves by ourselves. And the introduction of this international group of players in the area does not really, in my understanding of it, doesn't really jive very well with that idea. We've always said we defend ourselves by ourselves. We've always said that we don't want foreign troops on the ground for this very reason. And here we are outsourcing it to the United States, among others, but we've always said we won't outsource it even to our closest friends, namely the Americans. This seems to fly in the face of that. And I'll just add one more thing. Why on earth should Israel be expected to have any trust in so many of these nations' forces who represent countries who did nothing to alleviate the complexity of what was going on inside Gaza during the term of this kinetic war in the aftermath of October the 7th? The Egyptians did nothing. The Turks only made it worse. The Europeans, if they become engaged in this, I don't think they will, but if they do, only made it worse. Why should we now be expected to trust them to turn around and know how to make things any better or any more stable?
For sure, Benjamin. That's a lot of questions, and I'll try to take on a few of them. I think the last one about why trust anyone else, and of course those names of countries, definitely don't trust those individuals, is that this is the first time that I've seen of creating a different construct for addressing the terrorized zones, as in the actual ability to hold and stabilize an area and keep stabilization forces there. I mean, this is a key point. Like the Kosovo forces, all those countries are still there. They're still partnering, mentoring, training forces to keep those zones stable in much larger swaths of area with equal complexity. Back to your questions, though, about creating basically these forces being closer to Israel, Israel securing itself. I think messaging of this whole thing, while I understand why, for political reasons, there hasn't been a lot of messaging about it, will become vital. This is not occupation. This is liberation. These stabilization forces are beyond the buffer zone. So I think there could be a lot better explanation of what Israel has done over the last 2 years to create a new buffer zone, clearing it of all terror infrastructure, underground, above ground, and then where these stabilization forces would be creating stable bubbles. And then for me, that's a positive. Having between Israel, a buffer zone, a stabilization force in a completely stable area, doing policing and building new de-radicalized functioning communities between what might be some terror group or something as this process comes. I think for me that's a net positive, but also I think you could explain this the actual buffer creation of a new security area, a new paradigm, which is really gets to your other question about Israel freedom of maneuver. I think just post October 7th and what Israel's strategic environment that Israel's leadership has charted has created a new political paradigm. I don't think in any case that I see that Israel will give up that capability of seeing a threat, taking a threat, and going back to one of my first principles of this operation is that Israel will be the only force really politically feasible and capable to address, like Hamas or other terrorist groups, trying to rebuild in areas that haven't been stabilized yet. I think those are key, and I see it in the language right now.
Good. So thank you very, very much, John. I really appreciate it. Thanks for struggling through the conversation. It's very good of you. And I also will just say there's so much more that maybe we can discuss in future episodes. I obviously have a total aversion to any idea of the Palestinian Authority, for example, coming in and taking any role. I remind everybody they were murdering Israelis, Jewish and non-Jewish alike. by way of these homicide bombings until such time as we put a ring fence around ourselves. The international community often portrays it as putting a ring fence around them, but it was a ring fence around ourselves that was a physical barrier to them perpetrating those crimes against us. So much more to discuss. We'll do it in a future episode. I just wanted to say to our listeners again that your scholarship, John's scholarship, is truly exceptional. It's not a coincidence that it's his scholarship and nobody else's that is invoked regularly and often by the outgoing Minister of Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, who is the closest confidant of Prime Minister Netanyahu, who does the very same in international fora such as the UN General Assembly, addresses to joint sessions of the United States Congress, adversarial media, you name it, your work is invoked by both of those individuals. And it's because you travel to get on the ground, go and meet with, interview, interrogate the logic behind many of the senior players in the Israeli defense establishment. I've seen you do that. I've helped where I'm able to facilitate that. And I think that everybody should continue to do the very same. And thank you very much for bringing your expertise to this and for putting this to our listeners for their consideration. And to those listeners, I remind them, if you're enjoying the content on YouTube, subscribe and hit the bell. If you're enjoying the content on the audio podcast, Apple Podcast or Spotify, please subscribe, leave a rating and review, and share this content with your network. It helps us to get the word out. So, John, thank you very much. I wish you a peaceful weekend, a restful weekend, and of course, a Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, Benjamin. Thanks for having me.